the killing of Viola Liuzzo back in the
Comanche Peak nuclear power licensing case.
We sued the NCAA.
Mountaintop mining coal industry.
We represented 5 Jewish students.
Prisons to for-profit prison.
Unequal treatment.
Experienced sexual violence.
We gotta keep suing the bastards.
In 1982, several dozen trial lawyers got together and created an organization, Trial Lawyers for Public Justice. And the idea was that they were going to take on cases that were in the public interest, that were really important, that could make a change and impact society, but that were the type of cases that private law firms wouldn't be able to afford to take on. I think the organization was created in some ways in response to the Reagan administration, which really spurred an enormous growth in corporate power. And so you had more and more very large corporations that were just being allowed to operate in a completely lawless way. And the government was stopping a lot of its regulation of behaviors that were harming the environment, of things that were making products unsafe, of big corporations ripping people off. And I think what TOPJ was originally formed to do was to attempt to provide a counterweight for that, to come up with ways to protect the environment, to fight against corporate cheating.
Why and how did public justice come into being?
Public justice opened its doors on January 31st, 1982. The plaintiff's bar needed to combine its skills and resources with the goals and information and movement of the public interest community to make the world a better place. Its name was Trial Lawyers for Public Justice. I was joining it as the sole staff attorney.
And were you there from the beginning of the formation of the organization?
I was not only there from the beginning. I remember the first year in operation. We had some disagreements, as you would with any young trial lawyers, as to what direction to go. There was some very heated, argumentative, but always coming together in the end of decisions as to where and what cases we should take on.
Before public justice was created, there were other public interest law firms. For example, the ACLU did civil liberties, the NAACP did civil rights. But what most people didn't realize is both of those organizations were enforcing the Constitution. And the Constitution only applies to the government. And what people also didn't realize is that the way the ACLU and NAACP Legal Defense Fund were doing their litigation was they had some in-house counsel, but almost all the rest was being done by corporate law firms taking on those cases pro bono. And the problem was that when you were talking about suing big corporations for cheating or killing or discriminating against people, corporate law firms were not going to take those cases on. The only people who were going to take those cases on were trial lawyers. If a public interest law firm was going to focus not just on holding the government accountable, but also on holding corporations accountable for injuring people, it had to be the plaintiff's trial bar that got involved. And that's why Trial Lawyers for Public Justice, now Public Justice, was so essential.
From the very beginning, we focused on cases that we thought would lead to systemic changes, to try not just to win for a particular client, but to try and find cases that would change the way large corporations, governmental entities would operate, and trying to have really significant systemic change.
It's always been more about causes and leveling the playing field, holding, people or companies that harm individuals and communities accountable.
It's always been a dynamic organization. It's always been a courageous organization. It's always been a fighting organization. But I see now that it's also a creative organization.
We were trying to create a body of law through the cases that we brought that would bring relief to the consumers. This was in the era of Reagan.
Something we always laughed about was, it must be a good case for public justice because we're not going to make any money. We're taking only the losers. But
back then that was the case. That was the case back then. And some of the major early cases we were involved in, we lost. But we went out and fought the good fight and tried to do things that people had not done with the law before.
In the early 80s, I received a call from Ted Kennedy, and the issue was the killing of Viola Liuzzo in 1965 in the Selma March. And what was so interesting about the case is that it turned out, with testimony before the Kennedy Committee in the Senate, was that an FBI informant had actually killed Viola Liuzzo. We lost the case, but it changed the whole way the FBI operated their informant's procedures. And I think that's the case, along with a couple of others that came later, that really put trial lawyers for public justice on the map.
If we were going to really try and bring about change, we just had to get bigger. You know, when I joined the organization in 1997, I was the 5th lawyer. And it was a very, very small staff, and we just couldn't get involved in that many cases, and we couldn't have nearly the kind of impact that we wanted to have in some important areas of law.
And that all came down to getting individual trial lawyers and law firms all around the country involved in the organization.
I was the first woman president at TLPJ, and I might add, the youngest. When I took my turn, we went from 1 staff lawyer to 2 around 1994, and our organization was growing. We got a little bit bigger office.
When I came to public justice in 1994, it was very different than it is today. It was quite small.
At first, we had basically a janitor's closet.
I was one of 2 staff attorneys. We now have over 20 attorneys. There was, the attorney meetings were the executive director and myself and Leslie Bruckner, and that was it.
For a long time, we only had a few lawyers, and the few lawyers sort of worked on a wide variety of cases. And so it meant that we were involved in a lot of different fights, but not nearly as intensive a way as we wanted to be. So part of the growth has enabled us to specialize more.
It's the best lawyers literally in the country and those with the best intentions.
The organization has gone from a small organization of just a handful of attorneys to where I think there's 22 lawyers today that are really divided into certain program areas. You know, the food project, the for-profit prisons, environmental, access to justice, civil rights. And the organization has become more organized into these different program areas.
So we're looking for cases where we can have a significant impact, where we can change systems that we think are operating badly. And then we look for cases that concentrate in one of 3 areas. So one is something that threatens the sustainability of the earth, like climate change. So we get involved in cases involving coal polluters and factory farm polluters. We focus on cases that involve corporate cheating that makes the country less fair. So we focused on cases involving predatory lenders, and we focused on cases involving wage theft. And then the third is we focus on cases involving civil rights, gender violence on campuses and other types of sexism that's harmful, systemic racism. And we focused on attacks on LGBTQ rights. So those are our 3 areas of concentration.
How do you see the way this country's been going vis-a-vis class actions? Is it getting tougher to bring in?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, class actions have been under attack by corporate America for the last 2 decades. And public justice has been at the forefront of fighting back to protect class actions. If you can't bring a case on behalf of a class, then that becomes a green light for corporations to do all kinds of bad things to people and get away scot-free.
With some others, we created CAP for the purpose of promoting and supporting class action practice that serve the interests of consumers, investors, victims of civil rights abuses, and so on.
If you take what's happening in West Virginia, we've single-handedly stopped more pollution and more mountaintops from being taken off than anybody else in the country in Jim Hecker's mountaintop removal litigation.
And we brought the first federal citizen suit against a Appalachian coal mine. It was the largest ever proposed in the state. And it was the start of a 20-year odyssey that I've continued to this day. It's a constantly changing mix of regulatory requirements that I have to find new theories to challenge because they constantly undermine the legal theories that I've been winning in the courts.
Another line of cases at public justice that we started in the very beginning of that I'm enormously proud of is our Title IX litigation.
There was no appellate law whatsoever in the Title IX arena when we took the first case. And we started making law.
So originally the Title IX work was entirely focused on sports. So some university that had tons and tons of money going into men's sports and was really starving women's sports would eliminate a women's sports team, and we would get involved and challenge that and get the women's sports team reinstated. And over time what's happened is Adele Kimmel, who has really been a visionary in shaping the law in this area, has started to focus on the use of Title IX to go after gender violence on campus. Title IX provides some really powerful protections against colleges that are going to betray their students that way. And Adele has really been a national pioneer in bringing those types of cases. And so our work in Title IX has evolved in a really significant way over time.
We've had a lot of success in this area. We've represented many students who have experienced sexual violence by another student or by an employee of the school. And one way that we have made significant change is not only changing the law to make it easier for students to get justice in this area, but also by changing the culture of the school or the school district that we have sued. Earlier, I had been focusing on Title IX in the athletics arena, and I had been representing women intercollegiate athletes whose teams had been eliminated from their universities, as well as coaches who had been retaliated against for complaining about gender inequities in their athletics program.
We're the first, as far as I know, we took a case against Brown where there was unequal treatment between men's athletics and women's athletics. It was substantially unequal. And we took that all the way and set precedents on how treatment between men and women would be dealt with.
One case that stands out for me in particular is a case that I worked on with board member Linda Correa, and it's called Flood versus Florida Gulf Coast University. But this case involved a really successful volleyball coach, Jay Flood, who spoke up about gender inequities in her school's sports program. And when she did so, the school retaliated against her and fired her. And during the course of the mediation, this was in Fort Myers, Florida, the mediator pulled Linda and me out into the hallway out of earshot of our clients because he thought that our settlement demand was too high, and he thought we were being unreasonable. And at one point he said to us, "Do you understand what part of the world you're in? Here, we get $1 million in a dead baby case." And Linda, without batting an eye, calmly responded and said, "We're here to change your world." And that, to me, is emblematic of what public justice does. We're here to change the world. We're here to bring more justice to the world.
There are lots of times in which corporations break the law and really hurt people, and what they want to do is they don't want to talk about whether they broke the law or whether people were harmed. They want you to have to go to forced arbitration, where it's going to be a secretive process, where the arbitrator is going to be someone who's picked by the corporation, and it's a really rigged deal. One of our biggest wins against forced arbitration was in 2019 in New Prime versus Oliveira. And what we were able to win was that the truck drivers were exempt from the Federal Arbitration Act. So this took 1.5 million people who previously had had all their significant rights taken away from them, were suddenly able to go to court and bring cases. It was a huge victory. And there are a series of these barriers to justice that corporate America has come up with over a long period of time. And our organization has been the single most effective organization or law firm in the country in fighting against these.
Initially, when I became involved in the organization, it was really at the forefront of fighting against mandatory arbitration, court secrecy, protecting class action settlements, and it's become it still does all those things, but it's become so much more.
A lot of the cases are literally life-saving. So early in COVID, we got involved in this case in Missouri where people who worked in a meatpacking plant were working shoulder to shoulder. They had no personal protective equipment. They had their leave system was set up where anybody who missed more than 5 days of work was fired, and then they were given bonuses if they worked every single day of a month. And so they were exactly the type of place that was going to have a huge cluster of this, then very, very deadly disease. We brought a case in Missouri against a Smithfield meatpacking plant, and within a few days of the case, they suddenly started giving everybody masks. They started putting plastic barriers between people. They started having people spaced out in the line coming in and out of the meatpacking facility. And it really made a difference. It saved people's lives.
Castaneda versus the United States and Castaneda versus the state of California, two companion cases that we filed, are probably the most memorable cases and the most significant cases in some ways that I've worked on since I've been at Public Justice. Because of the publicity on the case and a related case that was being litigated by the ACLU's National Prison Project, detainee healthcare policies were changed so that detainees were no longer only entitled to emergency care, which meant you could only get care if you were about to drop dead right now, but they were entitled to get urgent care. So we helped to make policy change and got justice for the family after an 8-year battle, watching a client die, going to trial, and going up to the Supreme Court. It was quite something.
Public Justice has done more to fight for access to justice than any other nonprofit group or law firm in the country. We've won a ton of really important victories in making it possible for people who've been hurt when a corporation breaks the law, for them to be able to get into court and have a real remedy for what's happened to them. And I'm very proud of that work.
The people working at Public Justice are the most dedicated lawyers I've ever met, because they're doing it.
Not even a question.
Because they're doing it at such important work.
Not only do we do great work, but it's just a great place to work.
Becoming part of a community of people who shared the values and the commitment to the same kinds of issues and justice was like finding an ideological home.
I'm very grateful to having been able to work at Public Justice. I think it's a wonderful organization. I've been given an enormous amount of responsibility, but also an enormous amount of freedom to find the cases that I think are the most important and that can be the most successful. And there are very few organizations that would have given me that opportunity.
What Public Justice meant to me was the development of so many important relationships in my life that happened through my years working with Public Justice.
I could just go on and name so many people who have impressed me, but who have also just become good friends. And I think that speaks for our organization too.
I'm just so proud to be part of this organization. It has just, what I love most about it, it has continually expanded its reach.
There are more people doing public interest law now than there ever have been. But the obstacles, I feel like, are getting greater and greater.
Even if you're not an attorney, this is an organization that you should support, because here are attorneys that are going to battle to try to, have a better society, a more just society.
I think we're in another very challenging era because of the way our courts look. Our courts look very different than they did even 4 years ago.
In the face of the challenges that we have, you have to press forward.
If you need help, and it is a very big issue, and it is the right calls and a good cause, defending the rights of others, getting access to the court, protecting the environment, gender inequality, all of the wonderful things we do. There is an organization out there that you can go to that will help you, and they'll do it for the right reason.
Public Justice is fighting for you, and that's what people need to understand.
Our cases are not about abstractions. These are cases that really affect people's lives. I think the organization's more effective now than it's ever been in its history, and the first 40 years were great. I'm really excited to see what Public Justice can do in the next 40 years.